I have spent my life studying the rise and fall of nations from Eastern Europe after the Soviet collapse to countries torn apart by economic crises. I have walked through the ruins of systems that once believed themselves to be invincible, and now, with a heavy heart, I must say I see those same patterns unfolding here in the United States. This is not a theory. This is not another policy paper destined for a dusty archive. This is my final warning, a direct message to Washington, to the American people, and to anyone who still believes that decline can't happen here. I have witnessed a collapse firsthand. It never announces itself with fanfare. It begins quietly with arrogance, denial, and the illusion that we are different. When I look at America today, I recognize the symptoms of systemic decay, the same ones that marked the last days of empires: political paralysis, economic overreach, moral exhaustion. I have seen this before in the late stage Soviet Union, in Argentina's crisis, in the unraveling of once prosperous nations that thought themselves immune to gravity. The details change. The story does not. The United States is no longer facing a single crisis. It is trapped in a convergence of crises: economic, political, social, and psychological, each reinforcing the other in isolation. Any one of these could be managed. Together, they form a perfect storm. The fiscal trajectory, the erosion of trust, the political gridlock, all of these are now feeding on one another, accelerating the breakdown of a system that once symbolized resilience. What alarms me most is the timing. I chose this moment deliberately to speak plainly because the window for meaningful reform is closing fast. The conditions I observe today mirror those I witnessed in nations that reached the threshold of collapse. The same blindness, the same polarization, the same refusal to confront reality until the system itself forces the reckoning in Washington. They still pretend the danger is distant, a problem for the next election, the next administration, but collapse never waits for convenience. It does not ask permission from markets or voters. It comes when confidence dies, and confidence, once lost, does not return easily. When I travel abroad, I hear the same questions whispered by foreign ministers, central bankers, even former allies. What happened to America? They sense what too many Americans cannot yet admit, that the very credibility of American leadership is eroding. For decades, the United States led the world not just by power, but by example, a democracy that worked, an economy that delivered. Today, both are in doubt. The warning signs are everywhere. Economic indicators that once reflected strength now expose fragility. Political institutions that once stabilized the system now hinder its progress. The social fabric that once bound communities together now tears under pressure. I see a society where distrust has replaced solidarity, where every issue becomes a battlefield, and where truth itself is fractured beyond repair. In my years advising governments, I learned one cruel truth: collapse always looks impossible until it happens. No empire believes it can fail until it does. The Soviet elite believed the same thing right up to the moment the ruble collapsed and soldiers stopped receiving their pay. They told themselves, as America does today, that our system is exceptional, but reality is indifferent to exceptionalism. Mathematics, debt, social entropy, they obey no ideology. The deeper I study America's trajectory, the clearer the pattern becomes. A leadership class more interested in self-preservation than public service, an economy that produces wealth on paper but not prosperity in reality, a population losing faith not only in government but in the very idea of truth. These are not isolated issues. They are the anatomy of decline. I have tried for years to warn quietly through academic reports, advisory panels, and interviews, but polite caution no longer serves the moment. The stakes are too high and time too short. America's fiscal and institutional collapse will not look like a cinematic explosion. It will be a slow motion implosion, confidence draining away, systems failing silently until one day the lights simply don't turn back on. This is why I am speaking now, because what comes next is not inevitable, but it is increasingly likely. If America continues on its current path, the consequences will extend far beyond its borders. No empire collapses in isolation. The shock waves will ripple through global markets, alliances, and societies that still depend on American stability. I know what follows: collapse, the disorientation, the anger, the search for scapegoats. I have seen good people turn against one another when institutions fail to function properly. I have watched nations cannibalize themselves in denial of their own decay. I do not want to see that here. So I issue this final warning, not as a critic from the outside, but as someone who has dedicated his life to helping nations avoid the fate that now looms over my own. The question before us is no longer whether America can decline it, is whether we have the courage to confront that decline before it becomes irreversible. The patterns are set, the variables are known. The only unknown is whether we will act in time. When nations approach the edge of collapse, one paradox always emerges. It is a moment when decisive leadership becomes most necessary and simultaneously least possible. I call it the leadership paradox. I have witnessed it unfold across continents and over decades. In the final years of the Soviet Union, leaders who should have been confronting hard truths instead obsessed over managing their own survival. In Latin America, presidents promised reform but ruled through illusion. And now in Washington, I see the same paralysis at the very moment when vision and unity are required. The political system has become incapable of either. I sit in meetings with policymakers who talk endlessly about short-term optics, polling data, party advantage. next quarter's GDP print while the foundation beneath us cracks. No one wants to speak of the unthinkable that the United States might not be able to sustain the very model of governance and finance it once exported to the world. I have advised leaders under pressure before. I can tell when fear outweighs courage. In America today, fear rules. Fear of losing power, fear of telling the public what must be done, fear of breaking from tribal loyalties. Our leaders know what the numbers mean. They see the debt spiraling, the institutions hollowing out, the trust eroding. But to act decisively would mean admitting how far the decay has gone. And so they pretend performing stability while the system corrodes. This is the paradox. The closer a nation drifts toward crisis, the more its leaders become prisoners of denial. They sense that radical change is necessary, yet every incentive drives them to maintain the illusion that all is well. I have watched this mechanism destroy governments from within. Reformers are sidelined. Truth tellers are branded alarmists. Bureaucracies defend their existence rather than their mission. And the people confused and exhausted retreat into cynicism. This mutual paralysis is the hallmark of late-stage decline. The public senses it. Ordinary Americans may not follow bond yields or fiscal multipliers, but they know something is deeply wrong. They see infrastructure decay, prices rising faster than wages, and political elites living in a world entirely different from their own. That loss of faith is not merely a symptom, it is the core of collapse. When citizens cease to believe their institutions can or will protect them, the social contract breaks. Once broken, it is exceedingly difficult to repair. I have observed how rapidly legitimacy can evaporate. In Eastern Europe, it took months. In Latin America, sometimes weeks. One scandal, one economic shock, one failed election, then the facade crumbles. America believes itself insulated by size and wealth, but those are illusions. Confidence, not capital, sustains nations. When confidence dies, numbers follow. The tragedy is that the United States still possesses the talent, the innovation, and the institutional memory to reverse course. But the leadership class has become addicted to short-term theatrics. They mistake visibility for effectiveness, slogans for policy, and loyalty for competence. The very people most capable of navigating a crisis are marginalized because they refuse to play the partisan game. This is how empires end, not with invasion, but with exhaustion. I have seen it before, leaders arguing over semantics while the lights dim. Committees are forming to discuss reports no one will read. Each faction insists the other is to blame. And through it all, the people waiting, hoping someone somewhere still remembers how to lead. What keeps me awake at night is not only the dysfunction itself, but how normalized it has become. This mutual paralysis is the hallmark of late-stage decline. The public senses it Ordinary Americans may not follow bond yields or fiscal multipliers, but they know something is deeply wrong. They see infrastructure decay, prices rising faster than wages, and political elites living in a world entirely different from their own. That loss of faith is not merely a symptom, it is the core of collapse. When citizens cease to believe their institutions can or will protect them, the social contract breaks. Once broken, it is exceedingly difficult to repair. I have observed how rapidly legitimacy can evaporate. In Eastern Europe, it took months. In Latin America, sometimes weeks. One scandal, one economic shock, one failed election, then the facade crumbles. America believes itself insulated by size and wealth, but those are illusions. Confidence, not capital, sustains nations. When confidence dies, numbers follow. The tragedy is that the United States still possesses the talent, the innovation, and the institutional memory to reverse course, but the leadership class has become addicted to short-term theatrics. They mistake visibility for effectiveness, slogans for policy, and loyalty for competence. The very people most capable of navigating a crisis are marginalized because they refuse to play the partisan game. This is how empires end, not with invasion, but with exhaustion. I have seen it before, leaders arguing over semantics while the lights dim. Committees are forming to discuss reports no one will read. Each faction insists the other is to blame. And through it all, the people waiting, hoping someone somewhere still remembers how to lead. What keeps me awake at night is not only the dysfunction itself, but how normalized it has become. Government shutdowns, debt ceiling standoffs, open contempt for institutions once unthinkable, now barely make the news. America has grown accustomed to crisis. That is the most dangerous adaptation of all. When a society accepts dysfunction as the new normal, it loses the capacity to correct course. I say these words not in anger, but in deep sorrow, because I know what follows. When leadership fails, power seeks new forms of expression. History shows that in moments like this, the vacuum is rarely filled by reason. It is filled with resentment by demagogues who promise restoration while dismantling the last remaining pillars of democracy. We are closer to that precipice than most realize. The question is no longer whether America will face a reckoning. It is whether that reckoning will come through reform or through rupture. I have lived through both outcomes. I know which one leaves nations haunted for generations. And so I speak now urgently as one who has seen the aftermath of collapse, because if we do not reclaim leadership grounded in truth and courage, the United States will learn too late that even the greatest republics are not immune to gravity. I have spent much of my life studying economies, how they rise, how they crumble, and how illusions sustain them long after the fundamentals have rotted away. I have seen nations that appeared strong on paper collapse within months. because confidence vanished faster than anyone thought possible. I am now forced to say what I once believed unthinkable, that the United States stands on the edge of such an illusion. When I look at America's economy, I see a structure held together not by productivity or long-term investment, but by faith, faith in the dollar, faith in debt, and the assumption that tomorrow will always resemble today, that faith is the true currency of the modern age. Once it erodes, the numbers on balance sheets become meaningless. America's fiscal position is deteriorating at a pace that defies historical precedent. The debt ceiling debates are not the disease, they are the symptom. What matters is the trajectory borrowing to sustain consumption while neglecting the engines of real production. I have advised countries that have tried this path. It ends the same way every time, with austerity, unemployment, and disillusionment. I remember warning leaders in Eastern Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union, you cannot rebuild prosperity on borrowed promises. They ignored me, seduced by temporary inflows of foreign capital. Their currencies soared, their cities gleamed until one day the capital fled and the mirage dissolved. America is repeating the same mistake, only on a scale the world has never seen. The U.S. dollar still dominates global trade, but that dominance is fragile. It depends not on force, but on trust. Trust that America will remain stable, rational, and fiscally sound. Yet every debt crisis, every government shutdown, every political farce erodes that trust. I have spoken privately with finance ministers and central bankers worldwide. They are no longer asking if they should diversify away from the dollar, but rather how quickly they can do it without triggering a panic. If confidence in the dollar falters, the consequences will be swift and brutal. America's ability to finance its deficits at low cost will vanish overnight. Interest rates will soar. The cost of servicing debt will skyrocket. And the myth of endless borrowing will be shattered. I have seen this before. Once a currency loses credibility, it rarely recovers without enormous sacrifice. The danger is not just fiscal, it is philosophical. America has lost its capacity for long-term thinking. Political cycles reward immediacy, not sustainability. Corporations often prioritize quarterly profits over a long-term generational strategy. Voters demand benefits today and refuse to pay for them tomorrow. This temporal myopia, as I call it, is the most corrosive force in the American system. It blinds leaders to the mathematics of decline. I recall the early 2000s when America could have rebuilt its infrastructure, reformed its tax code, and invested in education and technology for the 21st century. Instead, it chose wars, tax cuts, and financial deregulation, the illusion of strength over the discipline of foresight. Now the bill is coming due. When I confront policymakers with this reality, I often hear the same refrain: America is different. We can always print more dollars. Yes, you can print money, but you cannot print trust. The world's willingness to hold your currency is not infinite. It depends on your stability, integrity, and competence. Lose those, and the printing press becomes a weapon of self-destruction. I remember Argentina in 2001. I walked through streets lined with closed banks and silent factories. The air was thick with disbelief, people asking how everything could vanish so quickly. They had believed in their leaders' promises until the very end. Then, in a single week, the illusion collapsed. I see echoes of that same complacency here in the United States, different in form, identical in function. The American economy is no longer driven by creation, but by speculation. The financial sector, which is supposed to serve the real economy, has become the economy itself. Complex derivatives, leveraged buyouts, and debt-fueled stock buybacks create wealth on screens, but not in communities. Meanwhile, wages stagnate, infrastructure crumbles, and small businesses suffocate under the weight of inefficiency. It is a prosperity mirage, a shimmering reflection of past greatness, masking present fragility. Every empire in decline constructs an economic illusion to comfort itself. The Romans debased their currency. The British relied on colonial rents. America's illusion is the belief that innovation and debt can substitute for discipline and production. But even the most innovative societies cannot defy arithmetic. I do not question America's capacity for renewal. I question its willingness. Renewal requires pain, higher taxes, lower consumption, structural reform. Yet every political incentive discourages such honesty. Instead, the parties compete to promise the impossible prosperity without sacrifice. It is a race to bankruptcy, disguised as democracy. In my lecture, I often show a simple graph, federal debt versus productivity growth. The lines move in opposite directions. The more we borrow, the less we produce. The correlation is no coincidence. It is the mathematics of decline. But numbers alone cannot convey the deeper truth that an economy mirrors the moral priorities of its society. When speculation replaces service, when convenience replaces character, the system begins to corrode from within. The American dream once rested on the idea that effort led to stability, that merit was rewarded, and that each generation could climb higher. That dream is fading. Young Americans now inherit a debt they did not create and an economy that no longer plays by the rules of fairness. They sense the betrayal, even if they cannot articulate it in economic terms. Disillusionment grows, and with it, anger, a combustible fuel that demagogues are already learning to exploit. I have seen this pattern before. Economic decline often breeds political extremism, and political extremism in turn accelerates economic decline. It is a feedback loop that, once ignited, consumes nations from within. America is not yet lost, but it is dangerously close to entering that cycle. I issue this warning not to predict doom, but to urge recognition. Economic collapse is not an event, it is a process. It begins invisibly in the quiet substitution of illusion for reality. It ends when that illusion can no longer sustain itself. The United States is approaching that breaking point. The question is whether it will awaken before the illusion turns to ash. When I travel abroad now, I no longer encounter the reverence that once accompanied the name America. I encounter question quiet, hesitant, but cutting. Professor, what happened to you? How did the world's most powerful democracy lose its sense of purpose? For decades, I defended my country in those conversations. I spoke of innovation, resilience, and the self-correcting strength of democracy. I can no longer do that, not honestly, because the truth is the world has begun to see America not as a model, but as a warning. I have worked in dozens of nations that look to the United States as a template for modern governance. Today, they see in us what they once saw in themselves just before collapse: arrogance, denial, and the fatal belief that the rules of decline do not apply. The mirror they hold up is unforgiving. And what it reflects back is a nation adrift, powerful, yes, but unstable, rich, yet indebted, loud, yet directionless. The international system that America built after World War II relied on one simple assumption, that Washington could be trusted. That assumption is dying. I hear it in closed-door meetings, in the careful phrasing of diplomats who no longer trust us to lead. Allies are hedging. Rivals are probing. The balance of confidence that once favored the United States has shifted subtly, but unmistakably. I was in Europe recently speaking with finance ministers who confided that they now view American politics as a risk factor in global markets, not our debt, not our technology, our politics. They plan for contingencies that were unthinkable a decade ago: a government default, another constitutional crisis, and even civil unrest. When the world begins to price in your dysfunction, your supremacy is already eroding. This erosion of credibility is the most dangerous phase of decline. Power depends as much on perception as on strength. The United States still possesses unmatched military capabilities and a vast economy, but credibility is the glue that binds those advantages into influence. When credibility decays, allies drift, adversaries advance, and the global order begins to fracture. I have seen this process before. The Soviet Union did not collapse because its army was weak. It collapsed because its ideology had lost all legitimacy. Britain did not surrender its empire by force. It bled it away through debt, exhaustion, and the slow realization that the world had moved on. America is now confronting that same reckoning, though it refuses to acknowledge it. China, Russia, and others are not simply opposing the United States. They are studying it, learning from our dysfunction, building systems designed to survive what they believe is America's eventual withdrawal from global leadership, and they are patient. They understand that decline does not happen in explosions. It happens one broken promise at a time. Credibility lost. The tragedy is that America's decline is not inevitable. It is a choice made through neglect, sustained by arrogance. We believed for too long that our institutions were self-correcting, that the world would always orbit around us. That illusion allowed decay to spread unnoticed. The irony is painful. The very system that taught the world how to govern is now teaching it how empires fall. When I speak to students abroad, they no longer ask how to emulate the United States. They ask how to avoid becoming it. They see our polarization, our inequality, our obsession with entertainment over truth. They see a nation that can no longer distinguish between spectacle and substance, and they are right to worry, because when the center of a global order falters, the periphery trembles, the consequences of America's instability ripple outward, trade networks strain, alliances weaken, global institutions built around the assumption of American reliability begin to malfunction. When the United States cannot make long-term commitments, the world's cooperative projects on climate, technology, health, and peace lose their anchor. I was part of many of those global initiatives. America still has time to reclaim its place, not through domination, but through restoration of integrity. But that time is running out. The world's patience is not infinite, and credibility, once lost, rarely returns. When the mirror of the world reflects back not admiration but pity, a nation must decide, will it learn from the reflection or shatter completely beneath it? I have spent decades advising nations on how to build stable institutions. I have seen what happens when they fail. And now, as I look at my own country, I see the same corrosion. I once warned others about slow, silent, internal. The United States is not being destroyed from outside. It is being hollowed out from within. Institutions do not collapse overnight. They rot gradually from the inside when integrity yields to ambition and principle bends to convenience. I have seen it happen in young democracies, in post-authoritarian states, in countries that mistook procedure for purpose, but I never imagined I would witness it in America. The erosion began quietly. Our democratic norms, once taken for granted, became negotiable. The peaceful transfer of power, the sanctity of elections, the independence of the judiciary, these pillars were once sacred. Now, they are debated like tactics in a game. When I hear politicians question the legitimacy of their own institutions, I hear the echo of every failed republic I have studied. In the Soviet Union, before the final collapse, I watched as faith in the system evaporated. People still obeyed laws, but they no longer believed in them. They worked because they had to, not because they trusted their leaders. That is where America is heading, a nation functioning on inertia rather than conviction. When citizens cease to believe in fairness, the social contract begins to unravel. I see it in the streets, in the polls, in the hollow eyes of young Americans who no longer think the future belongs to them. They are not cynical by nature. They are disillusioned by experience. They see a government that serves the powerful, a media that trades truth for attention, and an economy that rewards speculation over contribution. I remember walking through Eastern European capitals after the fall of communism. The walls were still standing, but the institutions inside them were empty offices without purpose, titles without authority. The structure existed, but the spirit was gone. America is approaching that same threshold. We still have the buildings, the ceremonies, the laws, but the trust that animates them is fading. In Washington, partisanship has replaced governance. Every issue becomes a battlefield. Every compromise a betrayal. The legislative process, once a deliberation of ideas, is now a perpetual campaign for dominance. I have sat in those rooms and spoken to the lawmakers, and I can tell you very few are thinking beyond the next election cycle. They are not steering the ship. They are fighting over who gets to stand at the wheel when it sinks. Our judiciary, the last bastion meant to uphold fairness, is being drawn into the same storm. Courts that once symbolized impartiality now mirror the divisions of the society they were built to stabilize. Injustice, when perceived as partisan, ceases to function as justice at all. I have seen this pattern destroy nations' confidence in law. Once the rule of law becomes the rule of factions, chaos is only a few steps away. The media, too, have changed from watchdogs to weapons. It no longer informs, it inflames. The pursuit of truth has been replaced by the pursuit of engagement. Outrage sells better than accuracy. And algorithms have learned to feed the public's worst instincts. I call this the attention economy of collapse. It consumes reality until only noise remains. In this storm of misinformation, people lose not only facts, but their very sense of what is real without shared reality. Democracy cannot function. How can a nation deliberate when it no longer agrees on what exists? I have seen countries disintegrate under such conditions where each faction constructs its own version of truth, its own history, and its own enemy. That process is already underway in the United States. The social fabric frays in ways statistics cannot capture. Communities are dissolving, families fragment under economic and ideological strain. Neighbors no longer trust one another. Urban and rural America might as well be separate nations. I have watched this pattern before the division of people into tribes of grievance. It always ends the same way, with the collapse of empathy, and soon after, the collapse of order. We once spoke of e pluribus unum, out of many, one. Today, we are without one. And without a unifying vision, power gravitates toward those who promise restoration through division. This is how authoritarianism begins, not with soldiers in the streets, but with citizens who surrender their freedom in exchange for belonging. I have studied the anatomy of such transitions. The first sign is exhaustion. The public grows tired of chaos and yearns for simplicity. The second is polarization. The middle collapses, and every disagreement becomes existential. The third is resignation. People stop believing change is possible through democratic means. Once that threshold is crossed, democracy becomes an empty shell. The tragedy is that America's decay is still reversible. I say this not as a naive optimist, but as someone who has seen nations rebuild from far worse. But renewal requires honesty, and honesty is the rarest commodity in Washington today. Our leaders fear the truth because it demands sacrifice. They would rather manage decline than confront it. I sometimes wonder what Tocqueville would write if he were to see America now. He once marveled at our civic spirit, our voluntary associations, our sense of shared destiny. Those virtues have not vanished. They have been smothered beneath layers of cynicism and spectacle. The American spirit still exists, but it is suffocating under the weight of its own institutions. Every great society reaches a point when it must choose between comfort and conscience. Rome faced it. Britain faced it. The Soviet Union faced it. And now America stands at that same crossroads. We can pretend the rot is manageable, or we can confront it before it consumes the core. I have seen what happens when nations choose denial. The erosion becomes irreversible. Institutions fail silently until one day they simply cease to function. And when that day comes, people will not remember the policies or the speeches. They will remember the silence of those who saw it coming and said nothing. I will not be silent. Not now. Not when the warning signs flash as brightly as they do today. Because if the United States, the world's oldest continuous democracy, cannot save itself from decay, then what hope remains for the others who once looked to us for light? The erosion within is the most dangerous form of collapse because it hides beneath the illusion of normalcy. The buildings still stand, the flags still wave, the songs are still sung, but the meaning behind them is fading. And if we do not act, soon even the symbols will ring hollow. I have often said that no economy, no government, no military can survive if the society beneath it falls apart. You can patch the budget, reform the laws, even modernize your weapons, but when the people no longer see themselves as one nation, collapse becomes a matter of time. That is where America stands today, a society divided not by disagreement, but by disbelief in each other. When I speak to young Americans, I hear a kind of quiet despair that I have never heard before. It is not rebellion, it is resignation. They tell me they no longer trust anyone in power. They no longer believe hard work guarantees stability. They no longer think the system cares about them. That disillusionment is not abstract. It is measurable in suicides, in addiction, in the hollowing out of entire communities. I recall the same emotional exhaustion in Eastern Europe following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Ordinary people, after decades of propaganda, no longer believed in anything. The government had lied for so long that the truth itself had lost its meaning. That psychological emptiness is the most dangerous stage of decline. It prepares a population to accept anything or anyone who promises belonging, even at the cost of freedom. In the United States, this emptiness manifests as polarization. Each side no longer sees the other as wrong, but as evil. And once you convince a society that its opponents are enemies, democracy, I see the signs everywhere, neighbors cutting off contact, families divided by politics, universities turning into ideological fortresses, media platforms rewarding outrage over empathy. It is a social cold war, a war that burns trust instead of cities. Economic inequality feeds this division. America's wealth gap has reached levels that I have only seen in nations on the verge of social unrest. The top fraction lives in a world of abstraction, digital wealth, private security, gated comfort, while millions struggle to afford the basics of dignity. History is unambiguous on this point. When inequality becomes moral rather than merely statistical, societies fracture. The French aristocracy once believed their wealth insulated them from the storm. They were wrong. I often hear that America's economy is booming, but a nation cannot be rich if its people feel poor. A stock index is not a soul. Behind the glowing numbers are families who cannot afford housing, education, or health care. They do not measure their lives in GDP. They measure them in hope. And that hope is fading. Have studied the sociology of decline. It always begins with alienation. People withdraw from institutions, then from one another, until the public square is empty. We are witnessing that retreat. Churches are losing congregations. Civic organizations are disappearing. Volunteerism, once a proud American tradition, is vanishing. In its place grows loneliness, a loneliness that technology cannot cure. Social media, which promised connection, has become a factory of division. Its algorithms reward outrage, amplify fear, and isolate us within echo chambers that make empathy impossible. I call it the digital fragmentation of the human spirit. We are more connected than ever, yet more alone than at any point in modern history. I recall visiting a small town in the Midwest not long ago. Once it was thriving factories, schools, small businesses, families. Now it stands half empty. The church doors are locked, the main street silent. I spoke to an elderly man sitting on the steps of what used to be a library. He told me, we stopped believing anyone would come to save us, so we stopped saving ourselves. Those words have haunted me ever since. That is what social fracture sounds like. Not violence, but silence. The silence of people who have given up. The United States has endured crises before, such as civil war, depression, and global conflict, and yet has emerged stronger. What is different now is the absence of unity. In previous eras, Americans still believed in a shared destiny. They argued fiercely, but they believed the argument mattered. Today, each camp believes the other's victory means the nation's death. That is not politics. That is nihilism. The cultural divide has become spiritual. Urban and rural America speak different languages, consume different media, and worship different gods of identity. The result is a nation without conversation, only competing monologues shouted into the void. In my research, I have seen this pattern precede every major internal conflict. When dialogue ends, disintegration begins. Even education, once the bridge between generations, now deepens the divide. Universities produce elites who are fluent in global languages but detached from local life. Meanwhile, millions of Americans feel unseen, unheard, unwanted. This disconnect fuels resentment, and resentment, once politicized, becomes a catalyst for revolution. I have seen this movie before. In countries I once advised, populist movements rose from the ashes of inequality and alienation. They promised dignity to those who felt abandoned, but their solutions were always the same: blame, purity, and vengeance. They gave people belonging, but at the cost of truth. America stands on the same precipice. The social fracture is not only political, it is existential. We are losing the ability to envision a shared future. When I lecture on democracy, I tell my students a nation is not sustained by laws alone. It is sustained by shared imagination. You must believe in the same story to live under the same flag. But what story do Americans still share? The myth of exceptionalism has curdled into entitlement. Patriotism has split into tribes, and faith in all forms, secular and religious, has been replaced by anxiety. People do not believe in a future because they no longer trust that anyone is steering toward it. This, to me, is the heart of the crisis. The collapse of meaning always precedes the collapse of systems. The art of administration has been replaced by the performance of authority. I have seen this pattern before. In the late years of the Soviet Union, ministers held meetings, issued decrees, signed documents, but the machinery beneath them no longer functioned. Policy had become ritual. Everyone knew the outcomes were meaningless, but no one dared to say it aloud. I see the same ritualism now in the corridors of American power statements, press briefings, committees, all motion, no movement. Competence is not simply intelligence. It is the alignment of knowledge, responsibility, and humility. It requires leaders to admit what they do not know and to surround themselves with those who possess the knowledge they lack. But in America today, expertise has become suspect. Scientists, engineers, public servants, those who should be guiding the ship, are dismissed as elites or bureaucrats. The word expert has turned into an insult. That is a fatal sign for any society. I recall the early days of my work with developing nations in crisis. The governments that recovered were not those with the most resources. but those willing to listen to competent advice, the ones that failed were those that replaced expertise with ideology. America has chosen the latter path. We no longer reward wisdom, we reward spectacle. Our institutions reflect this decay. The civil service, once a reservoir of competence, has been hollowed out. The art of administration has been replaced by the performance of authority. I have seen this pattern before. In the late years of the Soviet Union, ministers held meetings, issued decrets, signed documents, but the machinery beneath them no longer functioned. Policy had become ritual. Everyone knew the outcomes were meaningless, but no one dared to say it aloud. I see the same ritualism now in the corridors of American power statements, press briefings, committees, all motion, no movement. Competence is not simply intelligence. It is the alignment of knowledge, responsibility, and humility. It requires leaders to admit what they do not know and to surround themselves with those who possess the knowledge they lack. But in America today, expertise has become suspect. Scientists, engineers, public servants, those who should be guiding the ship, are dismissed as elites or bureaucrats. The word expert has turned into an insult. That is a fatal sign for any society. I recall the early days of my work with developing nations in crisis. The governments that recovered were not those with the most resources, but those willing to listen to competent advice. The ones that failed were those that replaced expertise with ideology. America has chosen the latter path. We no longer reward wisdom, we reward spectacle. Our institutions reflect this decay. The civil service, once a reservoir of competence, has been hollowed out. The best minds flee to the private sector, where their skills are highly valued, leaving behind agencies that are often paralyzed by politics. Universities, which should nurture intellectual independence, now chase funding and prestige. Even the media, once an instrument of investigation, has traded depth for immediacy. The result is a country that still believes it can solve problems while dismantling the very mechanisms that make problem solving possible. We outsource everything, our production, our planning, our thinking, believing that markets or algorithms will do the hard work for us. But markets cannot govern and algorithms cannot lead. I have observed how this erosion of competence spreads like a corrosive force. Once it begins, it accelerates. When leaders make poor decisions, institutions weaken. When institutions weaken, talented people leave. When talent leaves, decisions worsen. It is a feedback loop of decline, and America is trapped inside it. Even our responses to a crisis reveal it. In moments of national emergency, the machinery of government now stumbles over its own complexity. Agencies compete rather than coordinate. Bureaucrats hide behind procedure. Politicians search for scapegoats. The speed and coherence that once defined American response have given way to paralysis. The pandemic exposed this most brutally a nation with unparalleled scientific and technological capacity could not manage a unified response to a public health threat. The problem was not a lack of resources, it was a lack of competence. It was the inability to translate knowledge into coordinated action. I have seen this before in fragile states, the illusion of strength, masking systemic incapacity. What terrifies me most is how normalized this incompetence has become. Americans have grown accustomed to dysfunction. When bridges collapse, when power grids fail, when elections break down, we call it the new normal. That phrase should chill every citizen to the bone. There is nothing normal about failure. It is a warning. I once believed that America's decentralized system, its checks, its balances would preserve competence by forcing collaboration. But decentralization without accountability breeds entropy. Responsibility becomes diffused until no one feels responsible. The government that could once launch men to the moon can now barely repair its own roads. I remember a conversation I had years ago with a senior official from Singapore. He said to me, "In your country, Jeffrey, it seems you confuse argument with governance." He was right. We debate endlessly, but execute nothing. We produce white papers, not results. The appearance of deliberation has replaced the discipline of decision. This is not merely a technical failure. It is a moral one. Competence is a moral duty. When leaders are entrusted with the well-being of millions, ignorance is not just a weakness, it is a betrayal of trust. To govern without understanding, to command without preparation, is to gamble with the lives of others. The private sector mirrors this decline. Corporations once led by builders are now run by financiers. Innovation has been replaced by financial engineering. The measure of success is no longer the creation of value, but the extraction of it. This mentality seeps into governance itself, where policy is crafted like a quarterly report measured by optics rather than outcomes. And so the nation drifts. Each failure begets cynicism. Each scandal erodes faith. People stop expecting competence and leaders stop offering it. The result is a democracy that functions on habit rather than trust. I have seen this pattern many times before. It ends when citizens cease to believe that their leaders can solve anything at all. There is still time to reverse this. The restoration of competence begins with humility, the recognition that we have lost our way. It requires investment in knowledge, respect for institutions, and a willingness to empower those who know more than we do. It requires courage to tell the truth that America